Hi friends, welcome to episode number 3 of our Master Planning Level 1 series. In this episode, we will discuss in detail about the coverage group configuration in Microsoft Dynamics 365 Finance and Operation. This is going to be a very detailed video. Make sure that you watch this video until end. With that note, let's quickly jump into today's topic. So let's quickly get into the topic of coverage group in this episode number 3. And already we covered the episode number 1 introduction and episode number 2 where we kind of covered the strategies applicable for master planning. And make sure that you watch the episode number 1 and 2 before getting into this episode number 3. So first let's try to understand about what this coverage group, why this is used in master planning, right? So coverage group is a setting which is primarily used by the master scheduling in terms of to calculate the net requirements for an item, right? So whatever the configurations you have given in the coverage group, based on which the net requirement for an item is evaluated whenever the master planning runs in the system. So the coverage group controls how the net requirements are calculated for the product. The coverage groups are used to group products that have similar characteristics so that the products are scheduled in the same manner, right? So if you want to group certain list of items based on the coverage group, then all you have to do is you create a coverage group which have a similar characteristics and assign those coverage groups in the released products. So based on the characteristics on which you configure the coverage group, the master planning runs and generates the planned orders, the production orders or the purchase orders based on the same. So that's why the coverage group need to be used. So first of all, let's get into the system. I'll go to Dynamics 365 screen. So here, if you go to master planning, we are already in the master planning module. If you go to setup and if you click on coverage, you can configure the coverage groups. So configuring the coverage groups is the first most important setup as far as performing your master planning engine is concerned. So in order to do that, first of all, you need to understand this coverage group configuration. You need to configure all these parameters and whatever the items for which you want to follow the similar configuration, you need to create the coverage group here. For example, let's say you created a coverage group auto and you need to assign this coverage group in the release products, right? Before getting into some of the key configurations, let me show you how to configure this coverage group in the release product. First of all, let's assume that you already configured this coverage group auto. Then if you go to product information management, release products, in the release products page, let me open any of the item. Then there are multiple FOSS tabs. If you go to the plan FOSS tab, you need to assign the coverage group which you created over here. So once if you assign the coverage group over here, system by default for the item A0001, by default whenever the master planning runs, it takes the configuration of auto and then appropriately generates the planned purchase orders or production orders based on your business specific requirements, right? So that's the first configuration. Like once you create the coverage group, you need to make sure that you assign it in the product. Or the second option is you can use the item coverage wizard. Like so in this case, what happens is you assign the coverage group over here, or in the action pane in the plan section, you have a separate section for coverage, item coverage. So here you can provide item specific coverage configurations. Instead, if you do not wish to assign this coverage group for, let's say you have 10 different items in your inventory, for 9 items you want to follow a specific configuration, for one specific particular item you want to follow a different coverage group configuration. In those cases, you need to configure that in the release product under item coverage page. So this takes the precedence over the coverage group. For example, if for the rest all other 9 items, the configurations what you have given in the coverage group will be taken by the master planning engine. And even though if you have assigned coverage group over here, and also if you have assigned an item coverage for this particular item, then item coverage setting at the item coverage page will take the precedence over whatever the configuration you have given in the coverage group, right? So this is the next important thing where you can configure the item coverage with respect to a site, warehouse, and you can also configure the dimension. Whichever the dimension is active, based on those appropriate dimensions will be enabled in this page. So you can do this configuration at the dimension level, So that is completely possible in Dynamics 365. And so this is where you can do it. And also at the same time, the next important step here is that you can use the item coverage wizard in order to guide you through a step-by-step process of configuring the coverage or deleting the coverage groups. For example, you can have a coverage group for site 1, and you can have a different coverage for site 2, 3, like that. You can have n number of coverage configurations, but at the same time you can use this wizard on the top in order to go through a step-by-step process in terms of configuring the coverage for your respective items. So this is the next way of assigning the coverage groups for your items in the release products. So you can feel free to test this out. You just simply need to select the appropriate toggles. Let's say create new item coverage, click on next. Then it will let you to select the appropriate sites for which this coverage configuration is applicable. Like this, you need to complete the entire section in order to make sure that the coverage configuration is applicable for the item, right? And then the next thing is like I said, this coverage plan by dimension field must be selected for all product dimensions such as configuration, color, size, and style. So for example, what happens is if we go to in the product information management, dimension variants, and then storage dimension groups. So you need to make sure that there is a section called in the storage dimension tracking dimension group. You need to make sure that the appropriate dimensions are active in order to make sure that for those specific dimensions, if you want to do coverage at your business based on your business requirements, right? So let's say, for example, you want to do a coverage setting based on at the site and warehouse level. Make sure that you enable the site and warehouse, but not the location and the inventory status. Similarly, the same configuration applies in terms of your tracking dimension also. The tracking dimension also, let's say you want to do the coverage at the batch number level, then make sure that you make the coverage plan by dimension active for batch. So this has to be enabled before you get into the actual configuration at the item level, right? So you need to make sure that you are trying this out before getting into that. So once if you create under master planning, if I go to master planning, then coverage group, make sure that you create the coverage group and assign those coverage groups in the item. So then only the system will be able to take the configuration of the coverage group and create the planned orders based on those characteristics. So that's the importance of defining the coverage group, right? So now let's get into little more deeper on how we configure the coverage group and what are some of the important aspects or configurations we need to consider as we configure the coverage group. And like I said, the coverage group is taken as a least precedence over, and it actually kind of whatever the configuration which you have done at the item level overrides the configuration at the coverage group, and whatever the configuration you have done at the master plan level overrides the both actually. So you need to make sure that if you have done some configuration at the item level, then it obviously overrides whatever maybe the configuration you have done at the group level. So just make sure that based on your business requirements, you configure the system accordingly. So the next important concept which we need to discuss is the coverage time fence. So coverage time fence are typically the timing horizon within which you want to consider all the supply and demands, right? So by definition, it means planners can define a planning horizon, a planning time frame within which you want to consider all the supply and demands in order for the planned orders to generate. And any supply or demand which are falling apart from this particular horizon are not considered by the master planning engine. So for example, if you put a timing fence of 100 days, for the next 100 days, whatever the supply and demand which you are getting into the system are considered for your master planning, which for whatever the supply or demand which are not falling within the time fence are not considered for your master planning calculations. So, and also the important point is the coverage time fence is in days. That is the most important aspect. The requirement transactions won't be generated for any supply and demand that falls outside the coverage time fence. So any requirements or transactions that are falling outside this demand or supply is not considered. and coverage time fence affects only the input data for the master planning. Like I said, the master planning is an engine which takes the configuration from the coverage group and the master plan, and also your transactions, your purchase orders, your sales orders, your quotations are taken as an input, right? So coverage time fences affect only the input data. It does not affect the output data. So basically your outputs, the planned orders, are not affected by this, but your input data is primarily affected. And coverage time fences are specified in calendar days. And so if you remember, if you get into the coverage group, so by default we assign a calendar for each and every coverage group. It is mandatory, I would say. If you create a coverage group, it is always good to assign a calendar. Probably as we progress in the series, we discuss more in detail about what are the different types of calendars and how do we configure the working days for your manufacturing unit, and different types of shifts, how do we configure those. All we will quickly see as we progress in this series. Make sure that you subscribe to the channel and watch these episodes right from the beginning. And so first way is by, like I said, you define a calendar over here, and the coverage time fence is, let's say in this case for period 1 it is 100 days. So whatever the demands which are not falling under this 100 days will not be considered for by the master planning to generate the planned orders. And so the next important point here is that in case of planning optimization, planning optimization is time zone aware. Let's say we have a manufacturing unit in US, and another one is in Denmark, another is in Indian time zone. So the planning optimization is completely aware of the time zone, and based on which it generates the time fences and plan the order accordingly. But right now our intention is we are just focusing only on the deprecated master planning engine. So in that case, the time zone awareness is not considered. So you should be aware of that. So the next thing is so that is about the coverage time fence. So the coverage time fence can be defined at the coverage group level, or like I said, you can also define the coverage time fence at the item level. If I kind of navigate to product information management, release products. So if you have defined it at the item level gets the precedence over what you have configured in the coverage group. So let's say if I pick this item under plan, if I go to item coverage, let's say assume that we provide a particular site. If we go to general, under general section, if you click on override coverage group settings, you can see that the capability itself calls with the name overriding the coverage group settings. So this primarily overrides whatever you have configured in the coverage group, and here you can provide the coverage time fence. So let's say if you have provided a coverage time fence of 80 days, and in the coverage group you have a time fence of 100 days, 80 days is primarily taken as a coverage time fence. And at the same time, you can also configure the coverage time fence in the master plan. Even though we are not discussing about the master plan in this episode, I'll quickly show you. You go to setup, under plans, under master plans. So here also you have an option. If you are under the time fences in days, here also you have an option to configure the coverage in days, coverage time fence in days. So this configuration actually supersedes all other configurations. So make sure that you select the appropriate master plan. And if you want to kind of consider whether the time fence at the item level, or at the coverage group level, or at the time fence at the master plan level, you have to be absolutely sure about that. So this is about the coverage time fence. And the next important topic which we need to discuss on is the coverage code. To understand the coverage code, first of all, let me show you. So to understand more about the coverage code, we will get into the details of each and every code, what exactly possible, not possible. And I'm not going to give you a detailed description, but I will showcase the existing doc learn page, which will help you kind of understand easily the concept behind this, right? So the coverage code basically defines what is the type of technique which you want to use in order to replenish the inventory, right? So coverage time fence we discussed, but the coverage code is the most important concept as far as the coverage group is concerned. So for example, in this case, the coverage code primarily consists of 6 different codes: period, min-max, requirement, manual, priority, and decoupling point, right? So in case of, first we will look at the 4 options which we have, which is period, min-max, requirement and manual. Let me go to the D3 space screen. So this is where you need to configure. Only if you enable period, then the coverage period option is enabled. Otherwise for the others it is not. Let's say if it keep it as requirement, then you are not providing a period over here. But what is a period? So I have just navigated to the learn page. So for example, if you have selected the coverage code as period, then for the specific period of, let's say 100 days, if you have given a period of 100 days, for the next 100 days, whatever the requirements you have in the order fulfillment, for those you are making a single purchase order and the requirement is planned accordingly. For example, the total requirement of 40 quantity, a single purchase order is planned in order to meet the demand for the entire coverage period. So that's the business requirement. If you have, then you have to configure period as a coverage code. Next coverage group, coverage code which we have is requirement. So in case if you configure the requirement for it, you don't really need to configure for a specific period, but instead against a specific one-on-one requirement. If you want to plan your purchase orders in case of make to order scenarios, in those cases you need to go for requirement. Based on a specific requirement, you generate a purchase order. For a specific sales order 15 quantity, you generate a purchase order for 15 quantity. In this case, you are not necessarily stocking the material, but in this case you carry the risk of carrying the inventory. So you need to take an appropriate call based on your business specific needs. So that is about requirement. And the third option is in the coverage code we have is what we call as min-max. In case of min-max, what exactly happens is whenever your inventory falls under a minimum reorder level and the inventory goes to a minimum point, then you need to, you are asking the master planning engine to generate a planned order to take the inventory back to the maximum quantity, right? So you define the minimum and the maximum inventory levels, and whenever it kind of falls below the minimum inventory which is actually expected to be in stock, the master planning engine generates the planned purchase order or the planned production order based on the default order settings, and then based on which it takes the inventory back to the maximum quantity. So that is about min-max. And the fourth option is manual. Of course, it is self-explanatory that you do not want to rely on any of these min-max, requirement or period. Instead of which you want to give the discretion of generating the orders to your planners, and the planners manually decide on what is the quantity of orders which need to be generated, and they kind of firm the appropriate orders for purchase or production. So this is also some of the cases it is used. The manual coverage code is often used for products that system generated planned orders or not wanted. So in those cases, let's say some of the one-time purchase orders, one-time purchases which you generally make on an annual or hourly basis, in those cases you generally go for those items you configure a coverage group with the coverage code as manual, right? So that's about coverage code, and we have two more coverage codes, which is priority and decoupling point. Let me get back to the slide. Let me move the image. So if you look at priority based planning lets you prioritize replenishment orders to ensure that urgent or demand is prioritized over less important orders. Let's say if you have a replenishment order, but at the same time you have a stock out situation for a specific item, in those cases if you want to prioritize specific items, in that particular cases you need to go for the coverage code as priority, because this is generally used in case of demand driven material requirement planning. But we are not going to discuss in detail about priority or decoupling point, and decoupling point is only supported with planning optimization enabled, and this is not generally used in case of the deprecated master planning engine. And only in those cases you need to use this decoupling point coverage code. This will be treated as coverage code requirement. Yeah, if master planning is executed without, yeah, right. So if the master planning is executed without the planning optimization is enabled, the decoupling point requirement, even though you select the decoupling point, it is treated as requirement coverage code by the system whenever the master planning engine runs. So leave aside priority and decoupling point, but the other four areas are pretty important. Period is used if you want to make sure that the inventory is covered for a specific period. Min-max, like I said, whenever the inventory falls below a minimum in stock level, you replenish it to a maximum stock level. And requirement is like one-on-one mapping against a specific sales order. You want to create a demand, and based on the specific demand you want to create a specific supply, and then manually you give the discretion to the planners itself, and you do not expect the master planning engine to generate the orders. In those cases you need to use the coverage code as manual. I hope this is clear now. So the next concept which we need to learn is the safety margin. This is also one of the important concepts in master planning. The purpose of the safety margins is to enable a setup that provides some buffer time beyond the normal lead time for receipt, issue and reorder. So typically most of the manufacturing or the distribution or retail organizations where you depend on a material or the raw material from your vendors, typically it is always recommended to provide some safety margins whenever, because supply chain are expected to be more volatile, and you may not know what happens tomorrow. So it's always better to have some safety margins or buffer days in order to plan your orders accordingly, right? So all these margins are calculated in days. So you configure all these margins in the system so that based on these margin or buffer days, the master planning engine calculates the orders and generate the requirement accordingly. To put things simple, let me get into the Dynamics docs page so that it gives you a quick idea on how this margin works. Imagine like this. So the simple definition is reorder margin, the buffer time for placing the supply order; receipt margin, the buffer time for handling the incoming supply; and issue margin is the buffer time for handling shipments. This might sound confusing, but let me explain you the concept pretty clearly with this diagram. So imagine like this. Generally, most of the cases, receipt margin is the mostly used configuration in the coverage group. So for example, you have a demand requirement for a date on 30th Jan, right? So this is where you need to fulfill your demand, but you have given an issue margin in the system in the coverage group. In the coverage group, if you get into the coverage group, you have a section called for providing the safety margins: receipt margin, issue margin and reorder margin. So this is where you need to configure all those, right? So these all need to be configured in days. Let's say let me get into the definition. Yeah, if you look at this image, let's say we have a demand requirement to be fulfilled on 30th of January, but you have given an issue margin of 10 days, right? So if you have given an issue margin of 10 days, then system considers 20th Jan as the demand requirement date. So in those cases, all your orders, you are based on your orders, your supply, all these are preponed, so that you always have that buffer of 10 days to plan, make sure that even if there is any delay, you are able to fulfill your demand on time. So that is about issue margin. And receipt margin is like when the supply from the supply requirement, whatever the days you have given is deducted. So that let's say if you are based on the 20th Jan, if you want to fulfill a requirement on the 20th Jan, but you actually given 10 days as receipt margin, so on 10th Jan the material is expected to be received at your warehouse. So that's the minimum expectation which you have. But having considered that this is a buffer time, even there is a delay, even if you receive the material at 15th, still you will be able to fulfill the material on 20th Jan. And reorder margin is primarily you kind of add the reorder margin in days plus your lead time. Let's say the lead time for supply is 5 days, but you add a reorder margin of 5 more days, considering it as a buffer, maybe due to some transportation issues, so that it is added along with your lead time, so that the reorder margin plus lead time contributes your reorder margin, so that you are on a safer side. Even though you have a demand on 30th Jan, you plan your margin days, the safety margin days accordingly, so that you will be able to fulfill the demand irrespective of any kind of disruptions in the supply chain. So that's the whole idea of configuring safety margins in Dynamics 365. The safety margin for coverage group, let me also show you another concept. So the safety margin for coverage group and safety margin for master plan are summed during the master scheduling. So in case if you have configured the safety margin both in the coverage group and also in the master plan, they are actually summed up. So make sure that you configure it only at one place. Let me also show you how to configure that. if I'll just go to Dynamics 365 screen. So here this is where in the coverage group we need to configure the safety margins, or else even if I go to master plan, in the master plan also you will have the option to configure the safety margin in days. So you will have the similar three options: receipt margin days, issue margin days, and the reorder margin days. If you have configured in both the places, then the master schedule kind of sums up the total days. Make sure that you are configuring at the one place, but until unless you really have a requirement to configure it in both the areas, right? That's important. And go back to slide. So I'll also strongly recommend you guys to study on a concept called bullwhip effect. Probably let me know what is the logic of bullwhip effect is all about in the comment section. I'll be happy to hear from you, because this is something which kinds of resonates with this idea of having this safety margin until unless if it is not configured properly. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section, right? And the next important concept which we need to discuss is, I know there are a lot of concepts around master planning. Please bear with me or pause this video, take a short break, and then come back and watch this video until unless, because these are like very important concepts which we cannot skip as we are progressing in this master planning series. So the next important configuration is positive and negative days. The positive and negative days affect how master planning suggests planned orders and actions need to be generated, right? So if I get back to Dynamics 365 screen, let me go to coverage group. So in the coverage group, you have the option to configure the negative days and the positive days. So what exactly this positive and negative days mean? So positive days indicate how far in future master planning considers the current inventory or receipts to fulfill a future demand. So let's say you have a receipt that is happening in 28th December, but how far in the future you want the master planning to consider the inventory to fulfill a future demand. So basically the positive days is calculated by using a formula called ship date minus receipt date. If it is positive, you need to make sure that this is how the calculations are work. And if I put the positive days as 100 days, in the future for the next 100 days the existing on hand inventory will be considered in terms of fulfilling the upcoming demands. And at the same time, if you have given a negative day, then a negative day indicates how late item receipts will be allowed. They represent the number of days that you are willing to wait before you order new replenishment. Let's say you have a demand which is coming on 1st Jan 2025, but still you are willing to wait for 2 more days because you have a receipt which is coming from a vendor on 3rd of Jan. So you do not want to kind of you are kind of convince the customer, and you are willing to wait for this receipt to happen. And then if you want to fulfill that requirement, then master planning, if you want the master planning to consider that particular receipt, then you need to configure negative days as 2 days in the system. Always any receipts which are happening 2 days after the ship date, if you want to consider that, then you need to configure the negative days as 2 days in this case. So that's a quick example on that. Let me go back to Dynamics 365 screen. So here you can configure the negative days and the positive days, but the configuration in the coverage group, you can do that, and you can assign this coverage group to one item, or else you can configure the same positive days and negative days at the item coverage page also, which actually overrides whatever the configuration which you have in the coverage group. So I'll also show you how to configure this in the item master. If you go to product information management, release products. So in the item coverage page, you can also configure the same positive days and negative days, how far you want to consider the requirements of receipts. So if I select any of the item, if I go to item coverage page, under the general section, you need to enable, first of all, you need to enable override coverage group settings. And then here also you can configure the negative days and positive days. So here if negative days is given as 2 days, which means even though the receipt is happening after 2 days of the ship date, still the master planning engine considers that as a receipt, and it will not generate unnecessary planned orders in the system. So that's the objective of using positive days and negative days in the coverage group configuration. Let me open the master planning. master planning coverage group, right? So this is what we have kind of discussed today. Like we discussed about coverage code, coverage period, coverage time frames, positive days and negative days, what are safety margins, how do we configure all those coverage group configurations at the item level. You can do the same configuration at the master plan level also, but always the item coverage settings always takes the precedence over whatever the configuration you have at the item coverage group level, right? So let me go back to the slide. So like I said, you can specify it in the item coverage page or in the coverage group level also. So with that, I just don't want to overdump you with all these concepts, and if you feel bored, make sure that you pause the video at appropriate time intervals. Try this out in the demo instance or in your sandbox environment, because simply watching the video is not going to help. Make sure that you are trying out this on your sandbox or demo environment. I'll see you soon in episode number 4, where we will continue to discuss about other key concepts of the coverage group before we get into the configuration of the master plan. Make sure that you subscribe to the channel D365 Talks and follow my profile in LinkedIn. Thank you.